Let's look at capitalism. Because so far I've been telling you why I think that there is no capitalism in standard mainstream economics. I want to begin with a distinction that I already made, and I want to make once more. Capitalism is not markets. Societies always had markets. The Phoenicians had markets, the ancient Greeks had markets. They were not capitalist societies. They were societies with markets. Something happened towards the end of the Middle Ages and was elevated to a higher echelon towards the end of the 18th century in Amsterdam and in Britain. That transformed society from being a society with markets to being a market society. And by that, what I mean was to start the process where almost everything was commodified. Before that, land was not for sale. You either inherited land, or you were a peasant, a landless peasant, or sometimes, if you raised an army, you conquered land. There was no real estate market, the classifieds. There was no labor market. Either you worked for some baron, okay? And if you opposed that social arrangement, your head was removed from your shoulders, okay? Or you never worked because you were the baron. There was no labor market. You couldn't quit, say, look, I don't want to be your peasant, I'll be somebody else's peasant. So the creation of labor markets, of real estate markets, of capital markets, is a very recent phenomenon, and that's capitalism. For the purposes of what I want to say today, I want to home in on a particular year, quite early in the piece. It's the year 1599. On the day or week when William Shakespeare, was at his theater struggling to complete Hamlet, something remarkable happened. The first joint stock company was founded. The first company whose shares were tradable and anonymous, where you could buy a share without declaring who you are, and if I bought it from you, I could sell it to somebody else as if it was a piece of paper. It was called the British India Company. Within 3 years, the British India Company had effectively destroyed all the markets in India and had taken them over with an army of 200,000 soldiers, much larger than Britain's army or France's army. That was one company. You're familiar with the story. Tradable shares unleashed a very powerful genie that had a capacity to turbocharge and weaponize capital formation. It was an essential moment. Right? Then you had a period of the late 18th century, early 19th century, very tepid capitalism. When Karl Marx was writing his wonderful Communist Manifesto, the first 4 pages is the greatest eulogy for globalization ever. He talks about the way in which the bourgeoisie is, through the spread of global markets, battering down the Chinese walls of prejudice and liberating people from wrong conceptions of the universe and of themselves. It wasn't happening. That was in the imagination of Karl Marx. It happened much later. Much later. He was prescient. Right? When did it really happen? It happened after the 1870s, when Maxwell came up with his wonderful equations of electromagnetism. Those equations that blended, unified the theory of magnetism with the theory of electricity gave rise to what we know now as capitalism. Because it was the basis for telecommunications, electricity, okay, the radio, and of course, and that is crucial, the networked firm. When Thomas Edison invented the lamp, the electric lamp, immediately in his mind he had the power station that produces electricity. And he was the first one to create a totally vertically integrated, gigantic monopoly. From the factory that pumps out the electricity, owning the grid, the cables that go through people's homes and businesses, all the way to the electric lamp and the oven in the kitchen. Now, of course, the reason I'm mentioning that is because here we have the true nature of capitalism, which is not the competitive capitalism that Adam Smith had imagined of the baker, the brewer, and the butcher, whose small family-owned businesses compete with one another, converting private vices into public virtues. No. Here you have monopoly capitalism. The profit margins of the networked firms, whether this was railroads or, telephone companies or electricity grids. And then, of course, Henry Ford comes in with mass manufacturing of automobiles and other products. These huge economies of scale and network economies do two things. Firstly, they make sure that this competition is a joke. Okay? Rivalry, yes. You have General Electric pushing for a particular kind of current, the alternative current, and DC is what Edison. So there's like the Soviet Union versus the United States, not like the butcher against another butcher. The network company, by its very construction, was extremely expensive to fund. No bank had the capacity to forward to Edison the money he needed to build that structure, that network. So what happened? The mega firm gave rise to the mega bank. Consolidation of different banks into hyperbanks. And where did they find the money? The hyper, because if you and I get together, even if 100 of us get together, we put 10 euros together, we don't have the capacity to fund a network company. So the money came out of, as John Kenneth Galbraith once said, if people understood where money comes from, there would be a revolution. Came from thin air. So effectively, the mega banks got together, they had enough political power to offer the mega firms credit lines. So the money was fictitious. It was a little bit like the mega bankers pushing their hand through the membrane of the timeline into the future, grabbing value that has not been created yet, bringing it here, giving it to Edison to produce the value that will repay the future. And if you can do that, that's like having an ATM in your own living room. But of course, the more you reach out to the future and bring it to the present, the more difficult it is for the present to repay the future. At some point there is a crash, 1929. And then, of course, we know what happened in the 1930s. I don't want to get stuck into this. But I want to take you to the golden era of capitalism, which began with Bretton Woods in 1944, and which lasted for two decades, not even 2 decades, let's say 2 decades. This was the only time when unemployment crashed to 2%, inflation was between 2 and 2.5% everywhere, in Europe, in Japan, in the United States, in Canada. And for the first time, something that matters to us today, inequality dropped profoundly. For the first time and last time. That system was predicated upon a single currency. The euro is not the first single currency. The gold standard was the first single currency. And the Bretton Woods system effectively replaced gold with the American dollar. So we were all dollarized after the Second World War. That's what happened, especially this country, okay, and my country to some extent. Okay? But that dollar zone, which was global capitalism, was predicated upon a constant surplus recycling by the American economy. The Marshall Plan is just one example. It was not philanthropy to Germany, to Greece, and to Europe. It was not just a mechanism for subduing the Soviet Union. It was that as well. But it was a very smart and deliberate process of taking the surpluses of the only surplus economy at the time, the United States, bringing them here to finance the aggregate demand which was necessary to buy the net exports of the United States. That system collapsed. Why? Because Germany rose up, Japan rose up, and the United States became a deficit country. And at that point, unlike Europe, the Americans are far more pragmatic than we are. When they see that a design of theirs no longer works, do you know what they do? They destroy it. Whereas we keep hanging on. Remember the exchange rate mechanism? We were hanging on for dear life until the very end. The euro now, we're hanging on with the euro, with the same structure of the euro, even though we know it's not working. You have negative interest rates that are destroying your banks. But it's business as usual. The Americans don't do business as usual. When their own design, even if they love it, like Bretton Woods, doesn't work, okay, they kick it out. And they replace it with the opposite surplus recycling mechanism. They use their trade deficit in order to turn the American economy into a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking into the territory of the United States the net exports of Germany, of Holland, of Italy, of Japan, and of course later China. And how were they paying for it? Your industrialists, your bankers were sending 70% of their profits to Wall Street. That's how they paid for it. The Chinese, they bought bonds, they invested in America. The Japanese, the same. So that was a very disequilibrium situation, but a stable one. Or you can think of it as a stable disequilibrium or an unstable equilibrium. Choose your language, the same situation. And that crashed and burned in 2008.